Now, as the Horning Professor in the Humanities, she obtained her PhD from Indiana University in the department I'm currently on leave from. Her work ranges widely from early modern science to the 18th century medicine, 20th century environmental history. She has an eclectic interest in animal experimentation, natural history, anatomy, wetland ecology, and food. She's also a great cook, among other things. A year and a half ago, she published a skeptical review in the Pacific Standard entitled Analyzing Culture with Google Books. Today, she'll be given us her latest thoughts on Google Books, the Ngram, and culturomics.
Culturomics. Okay. Thanks, Jim. Thank you all for coming. And yeah, don't forget there's food in the back there, so feel free to eat. So I will begin with Cleo, goddess of history. And I come to this as someone who is still very much learning about digital humanities and is in some ways kind of skeptical about it, as this article said. So I've written about this topic before. I'm going to try not to repeat what I said there a year and a half ago. You can read it online. And my critique of culturomics is partly based on what it says about what history is or what history can be or what history should be. And that's kind of both my problem with it and also opens up other possibilities. So this all started with Google Books. According to Google's own history of the Google Books project, which you can find on the Google Books website, it was introduced at the Frankfurt Book Fair, somewhat ironically, I think, at the end of 2004, as the Google Print Library Project, which was made possible by partnerships with Harvard, the University of Michigan, the New York Public Library, Oxford, and Stanford. The combined collections at that point in those libraries was estimated to exceed 15 million volumes, and the point was then to have this very ambitious plan to digitize not only all of these books, but in fact to digitize every printed book in the world. And this plan has certainly been going great guns in many ways. There are many, many books on Google Books, as you all know. But it's also, since 2005, that is very shortly after it was introduced, it's been bogged down in the courts with lawsuits over copyright. Not so much an issue with pre-1900 works, but certainly an issue with 20th century works and 21st century works in terms of who owns these books and who's going to get credit and all of those things. So Google Books, as many of us who use them a lot, and I certainly use them a lot, many of us know, has their issues. The cameras that they use can scan 1,000 pages an hour, but inevitably that means that there are a significant number of errors in the scanning. And even by 2007, only a couple years after this is introduced, there are some pretty serious critiques of both the quality of the scans, but also the quality of the metadata. And this is still a big issue, that the metadata, that is the kind of matching the title and the author and so forth of the book with the book, isn't always very well done. You can't always find what you want. And some of these problems, according to Google, have been addressed, but they're still serious enough, certainly, to provide some real issues, and particularly issues with culturomics, which, among other things, depends on metadata. So, as of March 2012, the number of scanned books on Google Books was over 20 million. But the scanning process has slowed down somewhat. Google estimated in 2010 that there were 130 million unique books in the world. I actually think that number sounds kind of low, but I don't know. And stated that it intended to scan all of them by 2020. So the theory then of culturomics, which we're going to get to, this is an Ngram search result that I just did yesterday. I put in the term cuisine and searched from 1800 to 2000. And you can see the term cuisine in English greatly increases after about 1980. in its use. So the Ngram is a free online tool, as we all know. It's very easy to use. It's sort of ridiculously easy to use, and you can spend an awful lot of time playing with it. You can type words in, and you just get all kinds of cool stuff, and so it's really fun. And it's gotten a lot of attention, both from historians and also from scientists. Interestingly, it was pretty much introduced in an article in Science magazine, even though it is supposedly a historical tool. This was an article in Science at the beginning of 2011. And almost simultaneously at the meeting of the American Historical Association in January 2011, there was a presentation on culturomics that in fact was brought in at the very last minute. And the then president of the AHA decided that this was so interesting that she would allow this session to be stuck into the program without previous notice. Many expressed great enthusiasm for this tool after the presentation at the AHA. There was a column in the AHA Perspectives. Tony Grafton, who was the new president of the AHA, expressed very slight reservations, mainly based on the total absence of historians among the co-authors of the Science article. And if you can see the authors, but the authors are all either in computer science or some other kind of scientific discipline. There are no historians. There isn't even anybody remotely in the humanities as a co-author of this article. But on the whole, he was very enthusiastic. He particularly pointed out the model of collaboration that culturomics could promote, and I think it was interesting that he pointed to that as something that was unique and valuable. But when historians started kind of thinking more about it, by the time this article appeared in Nature in June of 2011, with the claim that culturomics would, quote, make much of what historians do trivially easy, some of the gloss had definitely worn off. And Tony Grafton, who is quoted again in this article, was quite a bit less sanguine. He said, quote, "You can't help but worry that this is going to sweep the deck of all money for the humanities everywhere else." And to which I said, well, yeah. This article in Nature was a piece on Erez Lieberman-Eiden, who is one of the co-developers of the Ngram of culturomics. And it emphasizes that he is obviously a genius, computer genius, a genius in many other things, but also that he really had a humanities background, that he had taken courses in philosophy in college and in creative writing. And as I said in my piece, well, that means that I took physics in college so I could publish in Nature too. So it's like, no, that's not how it works. So what I have then today are more questions and answers about culturomics and about other kind of big data kinds of projects. And among these are, what are the claims that culturomics is making about doing history? If the claim is that this is making doing history easy, is this doing history? Is analyzing books, because what culturomics is doing kind of word analysis using Google Books. You put in a term, you find the frequency of that term over time. Is that what doing history is? Is history simply analyzing trends over time, or analyzing word usage over time, or analyzing books over time? Is that what history is? Is doing history simply analyzing data? And that's, as Dan pointed out, the term data has all kinds of different things, but also Patrick's point about identity is certainly relevant here. What does it mean to be a historian? What do we do when we do history? And what, in this case, then constitutes data? Are books data? Are books the set of data? Are the words in the books the data? As they're treated with this kind of analysis, books are a bunch of words. They're a set of words. There's really nothing about context, for example. There's just words. It's frequency, word frequency. Particularly those of us who work in earlier eras when printing was just kind of coming online. The context of the book itself, of the book's production, of when it was written, of why it was written, of who wrote it, these things seem to be important to me. When I look at books, I'm not just sort of mining them for words. So which is, I mean, it's a useful thing to do, but also the engram is pretty much useless for before 1800. So, because again, not only the metadata, but the way that Google Books scans pre-1800 books, you can't really search them very well. And one of the criticisms I made last year, which I don't think has been entirely answered, although a couple people, including ERA's Lieberman Aiden, who actually responded to my article, was that how representative are the books that Google digitized of general trends? They're books that are in academic libraries, and although the goal is to digitize every book ever printed, they haven't done that. So the ones that are there are books from academic libraries. And some academic libraries, there's a huge bias toward English language books. So maybe when they digitize every book in the world, we can say this has some kind of general applicability. I would say now it doesn't. Right now they focus on academic libraries which collect certain kinds of books. Anyone who has used different libraries knows that every library has different collecting policies and different ways of acquiring books. They don't all have the same books. And there's, so there are kind of different biases in their sample, however large the sample is, that I don't think are necessarily accounted for. So, and because it doesn't work well at all with books published before 1800, I kind of think it's also another means of kind of marginalizing pre-modern studies, and I think pre-modern studies are getting pretty marginalized as it is. So I do worry about that a lot. So I'm going to move on to a kind of related topic, but one of the underlying assumptions of culturomics is that history should be more rigorous and scientific. That's one of the claims that was made in the Science article, that claimed that culturomics extends the boundaries of rigorous quantitative inquiry to a wide array of new phenomena spanning the social sciences and the humanities. So the implication then is that history by itself is not rigorous because it's not quantitative. So from the outside, I think, and particularly from the point of view of many scientists, history is messy and contingent, which is kind of, yeah, it is. That's what history is. So why can't we find those patterns in history that we know exist and use them to predict the future? And certainly that is, a long time critique of history, that history, the way historians practice it, doesn't come up with kind of usable advice that we can use to guide us in our future endeavors or whatever. Why don't we have more data sets? Why don't we have more graphs, more mathematical modeling? This isn't a new idea, nor is the debate whether history is in fact a social science or a humanistic discipline. Those debates have been going on for hundreds of years. The idea of scientific history goes way back. I really like this. If those of you are familiar with the journal Past and Present may not remember that when it was first founded in 1952 by a group of Marxist historians, it was called a Journal of Scientific History. And in fact, this is the latest issue, which has a obituary for Eric Hobsbawm, who was indeed one of the original founders of Past and Present and a well-known Marxist historian. Past and Present began as a Marxist journal. So what did they mean by scientific history? Not probably what we would mean by it now. I think what they meant by scientific history was definitely having to do with Marxism and talking about economic causes and the means of production and things like that. So they kind of dropped the scientific history thing by the end of the 1950s, particularly as Soviet Marxism became quite discredited after 1956. A lot of people, not Hobsbawm in fact, who remained a diehard until the very end, but many of the original Marxist historians who founded Past and Present kind of moved away from explicitly declaring themselves Marxists after 1956. But in other kinds of scientific history includes something like cliometrics, which was an application of mathematical techniques, particularly economic techniques, to history. Introduced in the late 1950s, the kind of peak was this book, Time on the Cross, a kind of notorious book, as Stacy I'm sure knows, which used economic data to argue that slavery was both profitable and also, in comparison to other forms of labor, humane. And it was received originally in 1974. You would think, a decade after the Civil Rights Act, people might have been thinking about this differently, but no. A review in the New York Times commented, if a more important book about American history has been published in the last decade, I don't know about it. It has, he said, with one stroke, turned around a whole field of interpretation and exposed the frailty of history done without science. So there. But only a year after it was published, there was a devastating review by Thomas Haskell in the New York Review of Books, which found its claims of statistical precision quite specious. It said it relies on chains of assumption and estimation, said Haskell. He said it was a series of conjectures, but the conjectural basis of the evidence was hidden from the readers, so that the assumption was that there was, in fact, hard economic data to back this up, and the data all came from one plantation, apparently. So Haskell concluded, most readers of Tom and the Cross see only the silk purse of apparent scientific exactitude. The authors spared them the sight of the sow's ear from which it all came. Cliometrics therefore fell into disrepute, although it never entirely disappeared, and I would certainly argue it has a place in the practice of history. There is certainly a place for mathematical and economic analysis. I wouldn't want to throw it out the window. More recently, we have a kind of variation on this, which Patrick sent me an article on, actually called Cliodynamics, which is mathematical modeling of historical dynamics with, again, this aim of looking for patterns in history, that we really are a kind of pattern-obsessed people, that we want to see repetitions, we want to see historical dynamics. In some ways, we're back in the Middle Ages where history is, cyclical, that there is no arrow of time that moves forward, that we're always kind of folding back on ourselves. So, in conclusion, with all of these things, and particularly going back to culturomics, but also with all kinds of new digital tools, we're really configuring what history is, and a lot of us, including me, who have been in this profession for 35 years now, are trying to figure out, what is history? What is it I'm supposed to be doing now? How is what I've been doing for the past 30 years changing because of all these new tools, because of new ways of looking at time? It's very exciting. It's also quite daunting. As one thing about Google Books is that suddenly you have access to all kinds of things you didn't have access to before, which unfortunately means then you have to look at them all. So you can no longer kind of have that blissful ignorance of, well, it's in that archive over there and I'm just not going to look at that. You don't have that. And I think amid this, we also need to communicate to our constituencies what we're doing. Things like the Newton Project that Rob talked about yesterday, I think does that very well. He has really been able to communicate to a lot of different audiences what the point of this is, why Newton was important, why we should look at these things. I'm not sure culturomics is a way to convey that sense of why history is important or what history is for. But because I think certainly now the humanities are definitely in a defensive mode, so communication above all seems like should be our objective. So, thank you.